Hello, and here we are, the Toni McLelland show. It's actually a bank holiday in the UK here today, but I've not missed a week for over a year and a half, and I didn't want to miss today, even though it's very somber in the UK. So just acknowledging that just for a moment. But it's Critical Reflections with your critical friend, and today I want to talk about change, because with everything that's going on in the UK, and we'll touch on that in just a moment, there is so much change going on, and has the last 3 years prepared us for that? So I have my very, very special guest today, Garry Turner, and he's going to be answering some of my questions. I think I'm going to put it, it's going to be a little bit of a discussion, but hopefully answering your questions too. So if you are joining us, if you are watching live, jump on, let us know that you're here. We'll make sure you get a shout out. And if you are watching back later, feel free to still add to the comments at a later point. So, hello, Garry. How are you?
I am doing very well. Thanks for having me back on, Toni. It's been a while.
It has, but it's always a pleasure to have you back on here. So tell me, Garry, because everyone knows me. Well, they should know me by now. So just tell us, just introduce yourself. You've got thinking partner there. What does that actually mean, Garry?
Yeah, thanks, Toni. Yeah, so my identity these days is quite interesting, Toni. So I work at the intersection of equity and inclusion, sales, sustainability, and I also act as a thinking partner within the chemicals industry. So really, that's all about holding space for senior leaders, for teams to do their best work, and really creating the conditions for them to slow down and, in fact, embrace change as part of that process.
So that's great. And thank you so much. And for those of you that know me, you should by now know that I work with organizations in social impact, social justice, and social mobility, and help C-suite leaders and board members to navigate change and crisis. And we are right in the middle of change and crisis. And I think that we need to try and get used to this. But before we do, Garry, explore this conversation, let's just say hi to Melody from Massachusetts. Hello, Melody. I know it's nice and early for you as well, and we've also got Leslie who's joining us as well. Hi, Leslie. Thank you for joining in today. And I can see that a few of you are watching, so don't be shy. Just pop your details in and just let us know where you're watching from or listening in from, and I'll make sure that you get a shout out on here today. So, as I mentioned, it's very somber in the UK today, and we need to acknowledge the fact that it's the Queen's funeral, and and I appreciate that some people may be anti-Queen or anti-monarchy, but whatever your views are, let's just respect that and respect this day in the comments and in terms of your thinking as well. So we've also got Linda here from Naples. Thank you for joining, Linda. Lovely to have you here. And we've also got Paul Murray. So thank you, Paul, for joining. And yes, thank you so much. Right. Where do we start, Garry Turner? So I'm just going to kind of put it like this, that over the last 3 years, because that's what the question was, have the last 3 years prepared us enough for change? Do let us know what you're thinking with the pandemic. That was kind of thrust upon us. And when we think about change, sometimes we can influence change. sometimes it's out of our control and we've got to move with it. Some can move with it and some can't move with it. And I think when I was thinking about the pandemic, I used to speak quite frequently about the fact that I used to see this as a global change management project. And you may have heard me refer to that previously, Garry.
Mm-hmm.
And I saw it as, I kind of likened it to working in an organization, but globally, what you have. And all the different countries with the different leaders were like the different departments and how everybody was dealing with things in their own different way. And, when I think about the last 3 years and I think about, for some reason, everything's in threes. Over the last week, we have had the death of our Queen. We have also had a new king and a new prime minister. So things are going to change for the better or not in some people's opinions. But let's just stick to this subject of change. Garry, do you think that the last 3 years have prepared us for change enough? And if you've got a thought around that, do just put your contributions in. And just want to say hi to Brianna from Georgia as well, and Leslie from North Carolina. So over to you, Garry.
What a beautiful setup, Toni. Do you know something? For me, and again, I give the extra frame as well, that I do work within a international corporate today, as well as doing some of this work on the outside. So I've experienced a personal version of the last 3 years and a workplace version. And I think there's a consistent answer to your question, Toni, for me, which is the last 3 years have opened up the gaps between where we were and actually what's possible in terms of our potential, in terms of our ability to connect as human beings, in terms of our ability to be creative, to be inclusive. So where I'm coming from with that is I think the universe has given us a beautiful opportunity to practice these new compassionate skills, such as you do, compassionate leadership. But are people ready for it is a completely different question. I think it's catching a lot of people off guard.
Yeah, and one of the things as well, Garry, just picking up on that, one of the things I've noticed as well is in terms of change, there's a lot of global change. I've seen so much where things are changing globally and people are more aware of it. People are more connected with what's going on in other countries and the wider impact. So not necessarily just on our doorstep. And I don't know if that was as a result of the pandemic and the lockdowns and things just being slower and people being more observant or paying more attention to news sources, but actually that's one of the things that I've noticed, that people are more connected, not as much as they should be, but more so than they were to what's going on in other countries. So really, really want to kind of highlight that. What's your thinking around that as we say hi to Ceylon? Lovely to have you here from Sri Lanka. Thank you so much for joining us today. So Garry, what are your thoughts about how it's all connected across the globe?
Yeah, I think this is really important. And again, through my lens within the chemicals industry, right, which touches every part of humanity, we're realizing, I think, as this singular human race that we are, right, regardless of where we live, our context, our background, yes, some have more privilege than others, et cetera, but I think what we've gone through the last 3 years is a real felt, not just at a head level, but a felt in our body realization of how connected everything is. And I think that feeling, that vulnerability, that shared sort of almost trauma in some ways of being so out of control with what we're learning about, what's going on in Sri Lanka, what's going on in the US, what's going on in Africa, what's going on in the UK, and not feeling like we have the tools to understand or to empathize or to discuss these topics. I think that's part of the gap for me. And it's not through lack of willing, it's just been so much so quickly. And I think that's that's interesting. I think that's
the thing, isn't it? It's almost come down like an avalanche, everything. Because even if I think about the events of today with the Queen's funeral, it's actually a global event. With world leaders present in the UK. So it's almost as if everything's connected some way or another. and that's the piece that we can't really ignore. And when we think about organizations, we can't just be thinking about what our organization is doing in isolation of everything else going on in the world. We've really got to connect it. And so I'm going to divide it up, and I'm going to say there's two pieces to change. One is what the organization is, what it looks like for the organization and the wider piece. And the other bit is the change for that leader. What does change mean for the individual? So when I deal with change, I think about it in two very, very specific pieces. And I look at the organization almost being a person with different behaviors that I call organizational cultures, because those cultures have come predominantly from leaders that have led in the past. Currently, I've led organizations and I've looked back, Garry, and I've thought, wow, I can see me written all over that, and sometimes we don't think that we can, or we have that influence, but actually you're making your mark, your footprint is there. So I'm going to leave you to think about that one just for a moment, Garry, whilst I bring in some of these other contributions. So who have we got? We've got Simon Hodgkins saying it's a globally connected world. It absolutely is, especially when we think about sustainability, development, those kind of pieces. Thank you so much. And also when we're thinking about, a massive shift in diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, that was a global agenda, and it still is a global agenda, and it's moving at different rates in different places. But actually, a lot of the themes are very, very, very connected. Sustainable development, DEIB. Change in the UK is affecting everybody elsewhere. So, really just thinking about that. So any thoughts on that, Garry, just for a moment? I'm going to bring in Leslie and see what Paul's saying as well.
Yeah, well, I love to think, I was chatting with my wife this morning, and just think about it, Toni. How are we even able for this to be a global event today with the Queen's funeral? Partly because of technology, right? Because if we go back to when she started her reign, we didn't have TVs. So like, it's so fascinating. So the amount of the amount of data, the amount of information that we have out there. One of your commenters said earlier on, part of the challenge now, I think, both as individuals and as companies, is how do we use good quality information, and how do we actually even discern what good information is?
Well, that's what it is, because there's so much data. And even up to last week, I was working with a chief exec around KPIs and capturing data. And what data is useful? They're capturing some, but how useful is it? And that's just on a really minute level in comparison to what's going on globally. So really, let's think about the data that we're using and how things have moved. They really, really have moved. And let's just bring in and see what Leslie's saying. We've had to change if our intention is to stay positive, haven't we? Whether the last 3 years or the next, the intensity of impact is relative to one's awareness. Thank you so much. Change is always going to be there. It is evolving. And I think that this whole pandemic, it's kind of kicked people out of their comfort zone, because no one can really say now, we've always done it that way, because my mantra is that anything is possible. Anything is possible. A lot of us saw a pandemic that we didn't even think would even exist in our lifetime. That was for history. A lot of us saw an incident in the US that impacted everybody globally. We shouldn't be seeing that. People are going up to taking trips or thinking about going up to the moon, and these things, it's almost like we can do that tomorrow. Do you understand what I mean? Visiting space, rather. So it's all of those things that you think, well, actually, they were impossible, or I used to think about them as impossible, and now actually possible with science or equipment, the right knowledge. So my mind is quite open, and I think this is the piece where we need to start thinking about it in those two pieces. Let's deal with, as an individual, what are the things that we need to think about as an individual, because it starts with that self-awareness, doesn't it, Garry? So really just thinking about the self-awareness piece. Where do we start with that? What's your thinking around that? And if anyone that's watching now, if you have any thoughts around self-awareness and being prepared for change, then now do share it in the comments and I will make sure I pick that up. So Garry, on self-awareness, because that's where it starts, isn't it?
Well, this is such a critical part, and I think you're weaving for me together the critical part between organizations and individuals. And it is that humanness, right? Like we've gone beyond now the idea of human-centered organizations and inclusion. Those things are important, but how do we actually navigate change, which is like every day, right? Every minute, it's constant change, but we've almost come from this perceived stability over the last 30, 40, 50 years. And we're now going, oh my God, stuff's always changing. It's going to continue to change. So how do I navigate that? You can only navigate that through self-awareness, through understanding what's your triggers, what are your biases, like what do you get excited about, what do you want your future life to look like.
The other side of it is, Garry, as well. That's really exciting what you just said. But the other side of it as well, which we have to consider, is we shouldn't be allowing change to happen to us. We should also be influencing change. Mm-hmm. You know, and taking sometimes we can't control it, but we can control how we respond to it.
That's the point. Absolutely.
You know,
absolutely.
So it's not change that is something that is inflicted upon us, that we've got to go with it this way or that way. We can respond to it in different ways, in different, you know, at a different pace if we need to as well. So yeah, I think that when it comes to that word, people think, well, this is something I've got to sit back and watch. Well, actually, do you?
Well, what I'd love to add to that, Toni, there's also, this is where it gets fun, right? And if I can say that, in where a lot of people are grieving, a lot of people are finding their way over the last 3 years. For me, what I found is the fun in being vulnerable, showing a bit more of my whole self, asking questions of like, what do I enjoy? What do I not enjoy? What's Toni thinking about at the moment? You know, the more playful you make self-awareness, vulnerability, listening, these really deeply human traits, they help us navigate change with much more ease, much more grace, much more levity.
Absolutely. And just adding some curiosity in there as well. I almost made that sound really nice, didn't I? Adding some curiosity, because it can actually be an adventure of somewhere that we've never been before. To take out the word impossible and think about the word possible based on what some of the things I've said. You know, and it's an adventure in front of us. Where do we want it to go? If it was limitless, and what's stopping us? Because a lot of the times, you know, it's us that's stopping ourselves. There are things that are out of our control, but we need to maneuver within that, you know? And just on that note, Garry, while you catch your breath, I'm just going to kind of bring in some of these comments here. So what have we got? We've got Paul that's saying, my limited management training told me to be ready for change and interpersonal skills within all companies I've worked in. That's many years ago. Absolutely. We've always got to be ready. Always. Okay, so, you know, Sean's saying about data collection to only be used to create positive change. Well, the thing is that when you collect that data, depending on what the data is, it could be to improve your services in some way or another, or it could be as a reinforcement to know that what you're doing is right, you know? So there could be a variety of different things, but I really, really appreciate that contribution, Sean. And yes, where we can use it for positive change, let's do that. So Garry, do come in if you want to contribute anything at all. I'm just bringing some of these comments up.
I just really appreciate the conversation, Toni, because we've almost been conditioned, right, since day dot to think that we have to operate within this narrow box. And I think the opportunity of the last 3 years is, oh my God, like, what do you mean? I can ask questions I didn't think I could ask 3 years ago. I can actually work from anywhere in the world. Well, I can ask to make work for me and for the company.
That's right.
You know, these are thoughts that people didn't even think were possible 3 years ago. So I'm really excited by that. Back to your point about curiosity. Like,
Yeah,
what's the suggestions? What's the ideas? Come, you know, challenge, be brave, be bold, be curious. Like, now is the time to do that. I really believe that.
absolutely. Because it's almost like I kind of describe it like we're not waiting for change, we're in it.
Mm.
It's almost like that little whirlwind, you know, whirlpool, that we're in this piece now. So are we going to survive it? How do we get ready for the next pieces to come? Because we're in it. It's not something that we prepare now for something that's going to happen in 6 months, because we've got a new prime minister. It's a female. In the US, we've also got the vice president that's a female of color. Things are changing. If we look at the UK cabinet office now, there's diversity in there. What does that actually mean? But it's very different to what it was. Is it different, positive? Is it going to be a positive impact or not? So the thing about it is we know that these things are going to come, and that's on a larger level. But locally, when we know that things are going to come, what do we do? Do we sit back and wait, or do we take action? Because you and I, Garry, we're all about taking action, aren't we? So
Absolutely.
take action, steer it, swerve and steer and navigate.
And explore, if I may add, right? Like that, back to that curiosity, like how do you explore what the next iteration of you are individually, and how much value more back to link the organization, right? Like the more we show up, the more ideas we have, the more creativity, the more suggestions, it only amplifies and builds out the ability to change as a business.
Absolutely. So let's get some comments in here. So I believe most people were able to see many possibilities and their strengths when the world was hit by COVID-19, how we adapted according to the situation and developed many avenues to create opportunities. Thank you so much, Salone. Really appreciate your contribution there. And it reminds me of the change cycle, which we can talk about just in a moment. Melody saying anything is possible. It's why thinking outside the box works. We've been conditioned to do things the same all the time, haven't we? I mean, you know, I was kind of watching the news just over the weekend, and when Premiership football was starting back up, you know, they paid respect to the Queen, and a singer opened up with the national anthem and was singing it, and he actually said that he made mistakes by saying, you know, the Queen, God save the Queen, rather than the King. So, and I thought, just on a really simplistic level, that's going to take a little while, because he kind of reiterated the fact that for 20 years he's been singing it one way. So we also know that change doesn't happen overnight. And how do we respond to people when they get it wrong? Are we giving people a chance to get it wrong? Or do we automatically expect everybody to get it right? I'm going to leave you with that question there, Garry. I'm going to let you think on that for a minute. Let's get some more comments in there. There's always an opportunity on the other side of disappointment. I love that. Leslie, thank you so much. What else have we got? We've got, I think this is Paul. Change means stepping up and delivering for my customers, earning first. And Melody saying, change like what has been going on will impact generations to come. It's up to us to find the most compassionate lens. There is no limit to how much good we can do with it. We are all in this together. Thank you so much. And it's almost funny that you mentioned lens, because Garry and I, before we came live, we were talking about lens and how we see things. You know, that's really important. Did you want to say anything? Contribute anywhere on that, Garry?
Yeah, I'll just link the two things actually. So you mentioned before around almost my words. How do you avoid perfectionism? How do you embrace experimentation? How is it okay to make mistakes? I think that does very much link to the lens you look at, right? If you're looking at through that work people as a perfectionist, then you're not going to create much space for people to make mistakes. So it's really, and that comes back to your self-awareness piece, right? Which you started with, like how do I view the world? How do I view other people in that moment? And how do I allow myself the space to reflect, challenge, and, maybe even review my thinking and the lens that I look at?
Absolutely. And I think it's so important that, and I say all the time that the people that know everything are the ones that have the most to learn, because actually, somebody just very recently sent me an email just saying, because I highlighted something that they may not have seen, and they, in their email response to me, they said to me, "Thank you. I'm still learning. And I appreciate it because I will learn from it." And I looked at that and I thought, you know what, Garry? I thought, I'm learning too. And I'm learning, for me, that these things happen. These things are important to me. And I'm learning to call it out. We don't have to fall out, but change. And so while the person said, "Oh, I'm learning," I realized that I was changing too, because it was something that I wouldn't normally have done. Yeah, not in the way that I had. So I think that change, when you change, it has an impact on me changing. And I love that word catalyst that you use quite frequently as well, Garry, don't you?
Yeah, because but I'm really drawing a bow on what we've discussed so far, Toni, in that we are all connected. And this is almost I don't want to co-opt Ubuntu, but I love the phrase, right? Which is, "I am, therefore we are." That beautiful African proverb, because it really is true. Like the decisions you make impact me. It may not be directly, but the ripple effects that we all have on one another as humans is real. That is how this network of life operates. And I think there's something beautiful in that. There's something really beautiful in that.
There is. And when we think about change as well from an individual perspective, we have to think about that whole cycle of change. The shock that something's happened. This has never happened before. What? That whole moment of something, that realization that actually in my lifetime, I'm not going to see a queen again, for example. And I've known nothing but that whole piece about the king. It feels to me as if we've gone back in history, because I connect king with history. But that's for me. That's just an example. And what will this new prime minister bring? So whilst we anticipate those pieces on a larger scale, we need to recognize that we're in it right now. And how can we influence our piece? Regardless of what's going on up there, how can we influence our piece within ourselves and the people that are around us? That is a question to you, Garry. So what is it they're shaking your head?
I'm just absorbing. You're always full of wisdom, Toni. So I'm just absorbing. To be honest, I think one of the big things with this is community, right? We know that there's a rise in loneliness. Like, remote working is great. It does work for some people. Other people prefer to be in the office. There's a lot around this, I think, on a personal point of view, is how do we build and curate our networks that are around us, both at home and in the workplace. I think that's a critical part of being super conscious, really intentional about how do I keep that network as broad and diverse as possible, so that I don't get stuck and feeling lonely or with just one view of the world.
Absolutely. And I think that that's really, really important, and diversifying. And one of the things that I haven't really mentioned is my leadership model of change, which is really based on 3 different pieces, 3 different components. So you've got the behavior piece. What are those embedded behaviors? Innate, taught, learned, habitual behavior. What does that look like in each individual, and how does that present? Where did it come from? It could be an organization that you went into and you adopted this behavior because everybody behaves in this way. So you adopt, that kind of behavior. And then you've got the learning piece, kinesthetic, audio, and visual. How does that person take on board learning to change? Because no matter how many times, and I work with so many leaders, no matter how many times, it's like, I want you to change, Garry. So I'm going to keep telling you the same thing. And then when I keep telling you the same thing, my voice gets louder and louder and louder, because apparently you're not listening, because you haven't changed. So that's the piece around, not everybody that wants change can change.
Interesting challenge.
And there's no just about it. There's no just do this or just do that, because this is where just is a very flippant word, because it's action packed and could be loaded. Just for you isn't just for me. Just do that. It's just so simple. But simple isn't easy. See, Garry, I'm getting all warmed up now. I'm just trying to hold it together.
I love it. I'm going to actually add something in here, which is really important. And it really, again, it's bringing a lot of what we've discussed so far together. Life is complex. How the systems operate with one another, individually, workplace, sustainability, global supply chains, all of these are networks that all feed one another. And I think before 3 years ago, Toni, we thought stuff was quite linear. Like, oh, if I go to the shop, I just get stuff off the shelf and that's all fine. Don't think about anything else. And what we've realized the last 3 years, actually, there's huge networks that exist behind every simple act of conversation, getting a computer, walking down the shop, driving a car. And I think that level of complexity is something we can only embrace and understand when we come from that really human, compassionate lens that we've been discussing about.
Absolutely. And the more we do that through our networks and have an understanding, a larger understanding of what's going on and the impact, the better it will be. So, for example, when there's a war with Ukraine and Russia, it impacts our fuel. It impacts our diesel. And in turn, it impacts an organization. It impacts us individually when we're thinking about hybrid working and the cost of fuel in and out, or working from home. So while something's going on over there, this is the impact. And this is why, I'm so passionate about sustainable development as well, and incorporating that into change. Because if you incorporate that now and think about that now, then when 2030 comes, you don't have to, unpick everything you've done up to this point, and it will be a smaller transition. So that's kind of how I see that, Garry. But when we think about change, we think about the shock of something happening. And then we go through a variety of different emotions, denial. We've got denial that comes in there. No, this cannot be. Yeah.
It reminded me of the old Kubler-Ross grieving curve and all of that good stuff, Toni.
Yeah, this cannot be. And then we've got fear. What does this mean for me individually? What does this mean for our organization, which is where we saw lots of people thinking about their organizations. Oh my God, do I need to shut down? Do I need to put people before me, employees, etc.? So there was that fear piece. Then there's a sadness. And the thing about the biggest piece about the sadness piece is that, and this is where grief comes into this, because we start grieving for what we've lost, what we had. And when you start grieving for what you've had, you start thinking about the relationship that you had with this thing that you're going to lose. So am I getting too deep, Garry?
No, I don't think I think this is actually really important, because when I look even at my family, what's going on right now, to link again what's happened today with the Queen's funeral, again, whatever someone's view of monarchy or otherwise, it's really interesting to see the perceived relationship with that one single human being on the planet. And then you look at it from an organizational change point of view, and you're going, wow, if we can all believe that that one person had that much power and control and influence, what would happen if we channeled all of that collective insight and energy towards solving injustice and inequity and climate change? Like, 'cause it's obviously possible if we can get this collectively upset around this example. I'm really intrigued by it. Really intrigued.
Absolutely, and so you should be. And let's bring some of our listeners in. So what we've got is Leslie saying it's fabulous dialogue, and it's made even better by your wonderful contributions. And that was the whole purpose of today. Whilst Critical Reflections and the Toni McLelland Show is about empowering and inspiring, really what I want to do is just really prompt some thinking, get you reflecting about what you are going to do yourself, because we all have to take responsibility for our own actions. We are all accountable for our own actions as well. And not everything is out of our control. And even though sometimes things feel as if they are, what is in our control? This isn't something that's going on the TV and we're sitting back and watching this change taking place. We can influence it. And that's really just reinforcing what you've just said there so well, Garry. So greed of multinationals impacts on our cost of living. Thank you. Any other? So be constantly focused on what the needs of others are. When we address the needs, everyone can shine. The needs of a country down to the needs of those around you. Now, just kind of taking change from a different perspective, because some of it is forced upon us. Sometimes it's not. And so I kind of think about this statement as well, which is another one that I put out there, which is around everyone wants change, but no one wants to change. What have you got to say on that, Garry Turner?
Oh, Toni, you are dropping the profound bombs today, aren't you? I think for me, it comes back to this point around conditioning. We've been conditioned to seek assurance and guarantee. Every system is structured that way. Whereas if we actually come at it from a place of intentionality and curiosity and exploration, we can embrace change for ourselves and around us much, much more easily. I'm not saying it's easy, but the act of change becomes more playful if we're not seeking guarantees at the end of it.
And sometimes just a different approach to it. You don't have to be inflicted with it. You can maneuver it. You can navigate it.
Yeah.
You know?
Word.
And I think that there is this thing, a lot of the times when I see leaders, there is this piece where sometimes they don't know how to change it. And that's based on the individual as well. But it's really unusual, because I was working recently with a corporate leadership team, and this particular corporate leadership team, I had the chief exec of this corporate leadership team was doing things in a particular way, and the interpersonal skills wasn't as great as it maybe could have been, and the leadership team were fully aware of it. However, they kept on leaving this person who was really great at what they were doing, just not necessarily great at managing people, to be the face of the organization. Well, actually, why? If you know that this is not the greatest strength of the chief exec, why are you not putting yourself in between? Knowing that we need to communicate this, and why wait and then the communication goes out wrong, and then complain? Why not say, it's okay, I'll take care of this? Because ultimately, when we're doing these things and taking these decisions and making change, we have to think about different approaches, and we have to think about the end result. What is the win-win here? We want the win-win that's best for me as an individual, the chief exec as an individual, and the organization and the stakeholders. So why would you want to sit down and wait for something to happen so that you can complain?
I'm really curious, though, Toni, in your experience, like how often is not slowing down part of that problem, or giving ourselves permission to stop and breathe and come up with a strategy
and see? Because in all honesty, Garry, I was working with another leadership team, and what actually happened with that leadership team is that it was a new team and they all came together. And what I realized at that point was that what I was offering was not necessarily what was needed at that time. What they actually needed was just to come together and have conversation. And I highlighted it. Within 30 minutes of working with them, I was very quick to highlight this. But what it also meant was that sometimes you take information from others because they see it through their lens. But actually, where I listened to that person about this is what's needed, what needed to happen was I needed to see for myself and get a feel for myself. And I think sometimes we don't see, and go back to your thing about lens, I always encourage organizations to do the 360. I don't even call it feedback because feedback has a negative connotation, doesn't it? But a 360 consultation, staff, service users, clients, stakeholders, professionals you work with. How does this feel for you? So you can get a really accurate picture. Anyway, sorry, I can see it. I'm just going into my little piece there. But let's bring some thoughts in, and I want to come back to you with your thoughts, Garry. I know that we're over time, but just a few minutes, and then we'll be on the home straight. Sometimes leaders can hinder positive change for fear of loss of power, prestige, and recognition. Absolutely, Clive. And one of the things I say is that you know, so often I see leaders clutching hold of their power, but you don't become more powerful by holding on to it. You become more powerful by using it to empower others. And that's what I found over the years and by experience as well. Garry, any
yeah, it's really lovely because what's really coming up for me, Toni, is how you hold that space for people. Right, how you bring people into compassionate dialogue is what I call it. Like the ability for each person in that space to hear one another, see one another, and truly witness the dignity of each person in that space. Like this is what we don't do. We're so busy being busy that we forget the dignity of the human.
Right.
And what you've done is really intentionally make sure that's in the space, and that transforms the change ability.
And people are like, oh, I don't have time. Well, it's like time. Using the time to be productive in this way and reflective with your team is going to make you more productive in terms of your output and everything. But when we do this, and when we're thinking about change, quite often we have to rethink our vision, mission, values. Yeah, and our purpose. Because a lot of the work, when I do this work, a lot of the times that's where it leads to a review of that, because it's misaligned now. You know, so these are some of the things. So, still working on our change cycle, Garry. Let's we go through sadness, depression, and passiveness of what we have lost. Then we start bargaining and thinking about how can we maneuver this to make it good for me. Then there's acceptance, and you see the good. And then we need to think about how to make that more sustainable. And when we think about that model of change, we can apply that to little things or big things, you know. So really, I know for me, over the last 3 years or so, I've worked within this industry of change for nearly 30 years, but I do know something has definitely shifted over the last 3-4 years for me, for sure. And how I approach it. Sometimes I don't always see myself in it. I see myself outside of it, and then I, maneuver around that, because sometimes I'm trying to test a theory of, the next part of what I'm going to see in terms of people's behaviors going through that model. So for me, I know that the last 3 years, I wouldn't say it's prepared me. It's made me think about my own changes, my own personal awareness. Yes, I'm definitely more aware. And yeah, I think things are more intentional than they were before. What about you, Garry?
Yeah, I've got to say intentionality, and I would say for me, slowing down more, like I'm saying no more gracefully, not no just to be belligerent or just to say like I don't want to do something, but that real does this. Like 3 years ago, I'd say yes to a lot more things without
Yeah,
really considering the implication on me or what was being
yeah.
asked, right? Whereas now is a lot more intentionality around that. What do you take on? Who do you spend time with? What work do you want to be doing? Where do you see yourself in the future? That depth of connection to self is massively different to where it was 3 years ago.
And the thing about it is that there are going to be people that don't want to change. They're quite happy plodding along, and that's fine.
Mhm.
But don't complain about things. Just plod along in the slow lane, you know, or that particular lane that's going at your speed. And that's the thing about it. Don't complain. If you're going to complain, get up and do something. Take action. You know what action? And when people come to me and I have limited time to help, I really do think about what's the where can I come in at to have the biggest piece of influence? Where can I come in? When can I come in to have the greatest impact? Because that's what I'm always thinking about, the timing of things as well. So any closing words from you, Garry? But just before we move to that, I just think one of the things that I actively encourage people in organizations to do, whether you're at board level or operational level, all levels, to come together, have some round table discussions. Forget about all these, the board don't know what's going on in the organization, and people operationally have no clue about the decisions that are made strategically. This is a time where the greatest impact is about that co-production, co-creation piece, the relationships, social capital.
You stole me exit comment, Tony. But hey,
Sorry.
what I'll add to that? No, it's so important. The co-creation part is huge, and also linked to the intentionality is the design. Like we can design and co-create the futures we envision, but we've got to slow down, get every person into the room. And my final reflection is, who are the voices and the roles of your organization that you tend to hear from the least? How do you make sure they're in the center more often? Because that's probably quite a lot of wisdom and ideas and innovation that you're not hearing from as often. So that design piece is massive, Tony, for me.
Absolutely. And I just want to kind of really highlight something that I said earlier on, and that was about the grieving. Remember the grieving piece. We're thinking about what we've lost, and we don't want to lose that. I also want to highlight the word just, which we kind of hung on that just for a moment, didn't we? Because actually, if we're going to answer that question, has the last 3 years prepared us enough for change? And thinking about the actioning piece, actioning that now. How do we change the people that want to? And that's going to be very, very different for each individual, depending on where you're at. Would you agree with that, Garry?
I do agree with that 100%. And I would also just add that this is where community and networks are critical. It's much easier to change more regularly and easily when you're in diverse networking.
Absolutely. And so it comes back to that leadership change model that I started talking about: behavior, innate, taught, learned, habitual, learning, kinesthetic, audio, and visual, and the environmental factors. You might be okay and function one way in this environment and change the environment, and that looks very, very different. But right centrally in the middle is the network and the community, because ultimately, without that piece there, none of the rest is going to help in terms of that change. So you've always got to be thinking about your network and who's around you, and changing that up, and just even simple things like, who are 5 people that you'd love to be around and why? Asking yourself that. How can they help you to thrive? And what can you offer? back in turn to those people there. So really today, just want to say thank you to everyone that's joined us. Today was really just creating that bank holiday reflective piece, just creating some space for some reflection around the change that's going on in the UK and how, over the last 3 years, how do we feel about it? Are you in a position to? Have you found it easy? What are the things you still need to do? Self-awareness, organizational culture. I look at an organization as a person with a behavior, and that behavior has come from somewhere. So we do need to change. If we want change, we all need to change. And I'm just going to leave it like that just for a moment. But I just want to say thank you so much, Garry. Really, really appreciate you. And Melody, Linda, have we got Paul, Leslie, Simon Hodgkins, thank you so much. Sean, we've got here Clive Foster as well, and I've got a couple that I couldn't see. They weren't identified on here, but I think I've kind of mentioned everybody. Salone as well. Brianna, thank you so much. If this is your first time listening in, then really, really appreciate you. Do put your thoughts in the comments and appreciate you. Thank you so much. So I just want to leave you by saying, what are you going to do about change? What are you going to do? Thank you, Garry.
Thanks, Toni.
All right. Thank you. So let's have you thinking about that, and I'll see you all next week. Bye for now. Thank you for spending time with me and my guest today on Critical Reflections with Your Critical Friend. Today, you got just a very, very small sprinkling of Toni's fairy dust. But if you'd like more, then do reach out for speaking or hosting. It's ToniMcLelland.com. For social impact, social justice, or social mobility, check out our work at firstlifegroup.com. I look forward to hearing from you. In the meantime, feel encouraged, be inspired, be empowered, and make a difference. Bye for now.